What if I told you the most advanced financial engine in the ancient world wasn't tea forged from metal or carved into stone, but woven quietly into strands of thread? What if the world's first portable database, its earliest encrypted ledger, and its most precise accounting algorithm lived inside a device that looked so ordinary, most people walked past it without a second glance? And what if this device was so powerful, so far ahead of its time, that an entire empire tried to erase its true purpose before outsiders could understand what it really was? Because the greatest secret of the Inca Empire wasn't tea, gold, or silver, or armies marching across mountain roads. It was a hidden operating system, a fiber-coded machine that could expose corruption, predict shortages, track wealth across millions, and carry the economic heartbeat of an empire inside a single rope. That forbidden device was the quipu. To understand how something so simple became so dangerous, we have to start far from the palaces of Cusco. High in the Andes, where the air grows thin and the wind moves like a warning, there is a forgotten storage hall, half collapsed, half swallowed by silence. Most visitors barely notice it, but inside its dust-covered floor lies something burned into the stone, the blackened remains of a quipu. It wasn't lost, it wasn't dropped, it wasn't abandoned. It was deliberately destroyed, the fibers charred until their meaning almost vanished. And that single detail tells us everything. Quipus weren't burned unless the information they carried threatened someone powerful. They were the empire's memory, its truth machine. Destroying one was the equivalent of deleting an entire database, not out of mistake, but out of fear. This quipu was not ordinary. Its primary cord, the thick central strand, was dyed a deep, unnatural black. That color wasn't used for crops or household records. Black string belonged only to military treasury ledgers, the highest classification of quipus in the empire. These were the records that tracked gold flow, metal production, labor distribution, supply chain stability, and the economic pulse of entire provinces. This quipu didn't contain simple numbers. It contained leverage, information that could expose a governor, implicate a noble, or reveal a secret privilege being abused behind closed doors. In some cases, a single treasury quipu held enough evidence to collapse the reputation of an entire administrative unit. But the strangest clue comes from what didn't burn. When archaeologists lifted the ash, they found that the quipu had been structured in a way used only for anomaly detection. Treasury quipus weren't written like narrative documents. They were built like algorithms. Every color, thickness, fiber twist, and knot spacing represented not just data, but logic. They were compressions of economic reality, machine-readable records long before machines existed. And the people trained to read them, the quipu kamayoks, weren't accountants. They were data engineers long before the word existed. They memorized patterns, not numbers. They saw structure inside color, meaning inside texture, and deviation inside silence. One Kamayok could carry the entire financial map of a region inside his mind, which is why their disappearance was considered more dangerous than the loss of any physical document. The burned quipu is linked to one such man, Amaru Yanak, a treasury Kamayok, assigned to investigate irregularities in the region. Local accounts say he arrived quietly, interviewed no one, inspected supply houses, looked at storage volumes, touched grain piles to check moisture, counted llama caravans, and examined the cords in silence. And then he vanished. No burial, no report, no belongings. Only this burned quipu remained, as if someone wanted his knowledge to die with him. But clues survive in the surviving strands. The first subsidiary cord, dyed yellow, is thicker than any normal cord used for gold inventory. That means the region's gold flow was rising at an unnatural pace. The second cord, orange-red, tracks copper production, yet it carries far more knots than expected. A surge like this normally appears only during wartime mobilization or when a province tries to manipulate its numbers. The third cord, brown, represents agricultural output, and here again the tension is too high, the knot frequency too dense. 3 sectors rising at once, gold, copper, and agriculture, is not normal variation. It is artificial inflation of productivity, like someone trying to make a region look more successful than it truly was. When a quipu shows anomalies in more than one sector, the empire sends inspectors. That was Amaru Yanak's role, to determine whether the irregularity was caused by natural fluctuation, corruption, or something more dangerous. The creation of a shadow economic engine operating outside imperial control. Because in the Inca world, nothing was more threatening than a governor or noble who tried to build private wealth in a system where private wealth was outlawed. If someone had found a way to redirect gold, accelerate production, or bypass treasury approval, they weren't just stealing, they were destabilizing the empire. And destabilization is exactly what this quipu shows. When the clusters are magnified, we find something extremely rare, microcords, thin strands almost invisible to the naked eye, used only to mark variance. Ordinary quipus have a handful of such cords. This one contains dozens. That means the region wasn't just unstable, it was resisting correction. Someone was adjusting numbers in real time, trying to mask inconsistencies, squeezing the system to keep it from revealing the truth. The quipu pushed back by generating more variance markers. It was like a living alarm. Then comes the most damning detail of all. Near the primary cord is a burned knot cluster shaped in a pattern used only for tax exemptions. Permissions granted exclusively by the Sapa Inca. A region with a tax exemption is a region with power. A region that abuses that exemption becomes a threat, and a threat inside the treasury system must be silenced before it spreads. This quipu wasn't burned because it was useless. It was burned because it was right. To understand why this quipu became dangerous, you have to imagine the Inca Empire not as a collection of temples and armies, but as a living supply chain stretched across mountains. Every province was a cell, every storage depot was a lung, every road was an artery, and the quipu was the nervous system, sending signals, detecting imbalance, and reacting long before collapse could spread. So, if one region began behaving strangely, producing more gold than its mines could possibly yield, reporting agricultural surpluses during drought, or moving copper at a speed that defied the limitations of llama caravans, the quipu didn't treat it as fortune. It treated it as a warning. The burned quipu carries exactly such a warning. When a treasury quipu shows triple sector inflation, gold, copper, agriculture, it means one of two things. Either the region has discovered a new economic engine, something powerful enough to rewrite its output profile overnight, or someone has constructed an illusion so convincing it fooled other administrators until a Kamayak arrived to verify the truth. Both possibilities are dangerous. A hidden engine suggests secret wealth extraction, unregistered mining tunnels, illegal workshops, or high-level collusion. An illusion suggests political manipulation, a governor trying to artificially inflate his province's value to gain favor, or a noble seeking leverage in Cusco. Either way, the empire must intervene. Amaru Yanak's arrival was not casual. The Kamayaks, sent for anomaly investigation, were selected for their memory, discipline, and immunity to bribes. They traveled alone. They carried no paper, no quipu of their own. Their tools were their fingers, their knowledge of knot logic, and their awareness of how economic behavior flowed through every level of the system. When Amaru reached the province, he didn't rush. He visited storehouses with no announcement, observed workers from a distance, cross-referenced grain levels by weight and sound, counted llama caravans by dust trails, and studied mining sites by examining the wear patterns on tools left near the entrances. He noticed things that ordinary officials ignored: the moisture in the grain, the width of footprints in the soil, the number of broken baskets near the storehouse walls. To him, these details were data, they were signals, and they did not match the numbers reported in the quipu. The cords told one story, the land told another. But the real contradiction emerged when Amaru examined the storage vaults. The quipu showed rising agricultural volume, yet the granaries were half full. It showed increased copper shipments, yet the tools used for smelting were worn down, suggesting underproduction. It recorded gold movement, yet the mine entrances had fewer tracks than expected. Everywhere he looked, the quipu's data clashed with physical reality. This meant the numbers were being rewritten somewhere upstream, by someone with access to both production and the quipu-esque creation process. Treasury quipus were not made by low-level workers. They were constructed in administrative centers by specialists trained to encode imperial data flawlessly. If this quipu was manipulated, the manipulation came from high within the provincial hierarchy, someone with status, protection, and motive. That is when Amaru encountered the most disturbing detail. The tax exemption logic embedded in the quipu was too fresh. Tax exemptions were rare, and when granted, the quipu cords recording them were usually older, worn by time and handling. But in this quipu, the exemption cluster was crisp, recently tied. This means the privilege was newly granted, and someone was using it aggressively to reshape production numbers. Whether the exemption was genuine or forged, Amaru could not know yet. But the presence of this knot confirmed his suspicion. Someone wanted the appearance of prosperity without the effort of producing it. From this point onward, witnesses say Amaru moved differently. He became quieter, inspecting at dusk, traveling between sites under cloud cover, keeping his findings in memory rather than making any physical record that could be confiscated. He was a Kamayak after all. His mind was the backup. If someone wanted the truth buried, they would need to bury him too. The next clue appeared in a remote warehouse near the mountain's edge. Amaru found storage units sealed with ropes that appeared untouched. But when he examined the knots carefully, he saw that the cords had been retied recently. Someone had opened and closed the storehouses, rearranged their contents, and repositioned the seals so precisely that no ordinary inspector would notice. Yet they overlooked something small. The dust pattern on the floor carried two sets of footprints. One normal, one with the heel worn down in a shape common among provincial administrators, who wore ceremonial footwear rather than working shoes. It meant a high-ranking official had been inside the storage vaults, possibly directing the manipulation. If the quipu recorded inflated numbers, and if the storage houses were being tampered with, and if a tax exemption was being abused, then this province wasn't just lying, it was running a parallel economic engine, one that siphoned wealth away from state control. Wealth that could fund private armies, build unauthorized alliances, or support a rebellion. For the Inca state, this was not a minor infraction, it was treason. That explains why Amaru's behavior became cautious. He was uncovering a crime that threatened not just finances, but political stability. He was no longer just an accountant. He had become a witness, and witnesses vanish. The last confirmed sighting of Amaru comes from a herder who saw him walking along a ridge before sunset, carrying nothing but a small pouch. He looked troubled, the herder said. Focused? As if he had finally understood the pattern behind the numbers, and the danger that came with knowing it. That same night, the quipu was burned in the temple below. The burn pattern tells a story of panic. The flames did not start from the bottom, where quipus are usually set alight for ritual disposal. They started from the center, exactly where the tax exemption knot sat. Someone wanted that part gone first. Someone feared the cluster at the root more than any other node on the string, and someone who understood the quipu's power must have realized that the fastest way to erase its truth was fire. Yet even burned quipus speak. Some fibers fuse in shapes that preserve their original knot spacing. Some colors darken but remain distinct under analysis. And the ash left behind reveals which sections burned hottest, the parts that someone desperately wanted erased. In this quipu, the hottest burn marks circle the very cluster that tied the entire anomaly together. The story only gets darker from here. To understand what happened after the quipu was burned, you must remember one thing about the Inca world. Information did not simply disappear. It moved. Even when a quipu turned to ash, the numbers inside it survived in the mind of the Kamayak who created it or the Kamayak who inspected it. And this is why Amaru Yanak's disappearance becomes the central riddle. A burned quipu without a body is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a cover-up. The morning after the quipu was burned, villagers in the region reported seeing two sets of smoke rising from different hillsides. One was from the temple, the ash of the quipu. The other came from a location deeper in the mountains where no temple, house, or workshop existed. Later, when investigators followed the path, they found nothing but burned vegetation and flattened grass, as if someone had cleared the ground to eliminate footprints or signs of struggle. There were no bones, no tools, no cloth fragments, nothing, as if the earth itself had been swept clean. Yet the silence speaks. The absence of a body is, in the Andes, the loudest sign of violence. If Amaru had died naturally, he would have been buried with rites. If he had been killed in conflict, the body would have been left as a warning. But when someone disappears without a trace, when their last location is scrubbed from the landscape, it means one thing. Someone feared what the person knew. And the burned quipu was the blueprint of that fear. To uncover the truth, the imperial investigators turned to the only surviving data, the char pattern, the knot remnants, and the faint twist patterns in the partially melted cords. These small details allowed them to reconstruct the quipu's logic. And what they found was far more dangerous than simple manipulation or theft. The anomalies spread across the cords suggested not just false reporting, but the existence of a hidden network, an unregistered supply chain feeding into a valley that did not appear on any official map. This was not a rogue warehouse, it was a shadow province. The secret valley lay beyond a ridge where ordinary travelers rarely ventured. It was fertile, protected by natural cliffs, and accessible only through narrow paths known only to local leaders. Oral histories from elderly herders, when questioned decades later, described caravans moving into that valley at night. They carried metal, textiles, grain, and even ceremonial objects, items that should have been stored in state-run warehouses, not diverted into private hands. This valley had its own storehouses, its own quipus, its own internal flow of wealth, and its existence depended entirely on the manipulation of the treasury quipu that Amaru inspected. If he exposed the valley, the entire political structure of the region could collapse. Not because of rebellion, but because of the truth. They had created an economy within an economy, a state within the state. And then comes the most remarkable detail. The burned quipu contained an extremely rare knot cluster near its lower section. It did not resemble categories of gold, copper, or agriculture. It matched only one class of data, the recording of people, not census data, not household numbers. This type of knot cluster was used only for tracking labor groups, knowledge specialists, temple workers, and people whose skills were critical to the empire. The cluster in this quipu did not reflect ordinary labor. It reflected skilled labor extraction, the movement of artisans, metalworkers, and quipu apprentices into the hidden valley. This meant the valley wasn't merely storing wealth, it was producing it. If the people with knowledge and skill moved there, if metalworkers were taken, if quipu apprentices were trained outside official institutions, then this valley wasn't a passive hiding place. It was an active economic engine, a forbidden one. This is why Amaru became dangerous. He had seen the movement of skilled workers. He had recognized the patterns of missing hands in workshops, missing families in villages, missing apprentices in the administrative centers. He had read the labor knot cluster. He had discovered people whose names existed in the chords but were missing in the world. The empire could tolerate the loss of grain or metal, but the loss of trained minds was a threat of a different magnitude. Even after the quipu was burned, the empire insisted on recovering whatever truth remained. Investigators interviewed local leaders, but their testimonies contradicted one another. Some claimed bandits attacked Amaru. Others spoke of landslides or storms. But one account, dismissed for years, came from a shepherd who spoke quietly, afraid repeating the same phrase, "He saw the Valley of the Knots. They cannot let him live if he saw it." The Valley of the Knots was a phrase with no official meaning. Yet it corresponded eerily with the economic logic of the burned quipu, a place where chords were tied without the empire's approval, a place where numbers were rewritten, a place where power was built silently, thread by thread. Eventually, the investigators concluded something shocking. The quipu had not been burned to hide the province's mistakes. It had been burned to hide another quipu, a second quipu, one that recorded the valley's true output, labor force, and economic capability, a master quipu for an unrecognized system. This second quipu was never found, but the burned quipu pointed to its existence through knot variations that suggested mirrored data. When one record is manipulated, the mirror record shows stress, and the stress in this quipu was immense. In the end, the empire did what empires do. They suppressed the story. They punished a handful of low-ranking officials, reassigned administrators, and dissolved several lineages that lived near the hidden valley. The disappearance of Amaru Yannick was never reported in official records. His name faded from memory. His investigation became a whisper, but the truth did not die. Not entirely. Centuries later, researchers studying the burned quipu fragments noticed something unusual. Tiny bands of green dye preserved in the ash. Green cords were used only for resources tied to sacred obligations, the kind of wealth that flowed into the empire's spiritual economy, not its military one. This confirmed the final piece of the puzzle. The hidden valley wasn't just extracting economic wealth, it was capturing sacred wealth. Textiles, ceremonial items, spiritual offerings, objects that should have been part of the empire's ritual flow. The valley's creators weren't just building a financial engine, they were building symbolic power. That combination, economic wealth and sacred authority, is what made the quipu worth burning. Because if a shadow valley controls both materials and meaning, it becomes untouchable. And if a Kamayak discovers it, he becomes disposable. So this is the secret written in the burned fibers. The Inca Empire wasn't as unified as history claims. Beneath its roads and palaces, beneath its quipus and rituals, there existed hidden pockets of power. Private economic engines running parallel to the official system, sustained by manipulated data and protected by fear. And somewhere in the dark, far from fire and ash, a missing quipu from a forbidden valley still waits, holding the true account of an economy that the empire tried to erase. The quipu they burned wasn't just a record, it was a map, a warning, a confession, and the key to the only financial system in the Andes that history never wrote down.